What's going on, everybody? You have Terence Latimer, owner-operator of Black Cactus Co-Working in beautiful downtown 29 Palms in the Joshua Tree National Park region, recording live for our 5th episode ever of Tsundoku and Tea Torrentously. I am super excited to be here, grateful to have you here. Also mindful that it is a hot July day in the Joshua Tree National Park region. As you all are, well, hopefully observing as we, try to improve with each and every episode, based off of video quality, creating sound and all that sort of good stuff. We've got our fan running in the background, trying not to run the AC. Well, actually, I'm going to keep it real. We can't run the AC because my AC's broke right now. Wait for the HVAC guy to come out, but please, if that's interrupting or, creating a not so fun listening experience, just bear with us as we continue to improve the quality of all things Tsundoku and tea torrentously. And no episode of Tsundoku and Tea Torrentously is complete without the tea of the week. And we're not talking about that gossip tea that you're used to find on all those other podcasts. We're talking about that real good, the tea leaf, right? So today's episode is brought to you by the Best Curriculum Enterprise, LLC, which is a education management firm based out here in the high desert. And they sponsor today's tea. We're drinking an ashwagandha tea by Buddha Teas. Now, I'm really excited about this one. As I understand it, ashwagandha is a ginseng that helps with anxiety reduction, stress relief, and also offers a bunch of other benefits, which, let's go ahead and read from the box here. Ashwagandha tea is a premier Ayurvedic adaptogen. Yeah, this is a reading podcast. That doesn't mean that we know how to read all the words well. Which is a compound that helps us to adapt to the ups and downs of life. Ashwagandha is one of the most revered herbs in India. Mild and earthy tasting, ashwagandha tea is naturally free of caffeine and can be enjoyed in the morning and evening. So yeah, absolutely. Special shout out to the Best Curriculum Enterprise, LLC. As I understand it, this is actually a local purchase. We got this from Sue's Health Food Store in Yucca Valley. So special shout out to the Best Curriculum Enterprise for sponsoring today's tea. Okay, so this section of the show, we dive into the book of the week. And so this week we are reading a classic titled Poetics by Aristotle. And lots of reasons for reading this book this week. Just to provide a little bit more context, I was encouraged by two really good friends of mine to expand on my writing. Both of them have sort of, communicated to me that I have been limiting myself to the written word. And some of that comes in the form of, both leveraging photography and videography as an opportunity to layer my storytelling. But then on the flip side, it's really diving into literary theory and literary criticism as an opportunity to understand, the history of storytelling from poetics, philosophy, cinema, and how those, I would just say compounding schools of thought have sort of consolidated into modern versions of storytelling and how that impacts the way that we are contextualizing, consciousness for all intents and purposes, right? And so diving into Aristotle and what the Greeks and even some of the Romans have been able to teach us as it relates to modern day storytelling is, some of my intentions for today's reading. We're going to read from the back excerpt, and then we're going to dive into the table of contents to just get a little bit of, again, just sort of a quantifiable contextualization of what we can expect to find inside of the book, right? one of the core concepts, in my opinion, of Tsundoku and tea, just through this lens of slow reading, is to allow, the front and back covers as an opportunity to, sort of introduce us into the concepts, right? And then we dive into the table of contents as an opportunity to understand what to expect. And then maybe even reading about the author, right? That gives us some additional insight in terms of, this very intimate process of downloading someone else's information into our brains, right? So just reading from the back, it starts with: the plot is a source and the soul of the tragedy. In his near contemporary account of classical Greek tragedy, Aristotle examines the dramatic elements of plot, character, language, and spectacle that combine to produce pity and fear in the audience, and asks why we derive pleasure from this apparently painful process. Taking examples from the plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, the Poetics introduce into literary criticism such central concepts as mimesis, which is imitation, hamartia, which is error, and catharsis, purification. Aristotle explains how the most effective tragedies rely on complication and resolution, recognition and reversals, while centering on characters of heroic stature, idealized yet true to life. One of the most powerful, perceptive, and influential works of criticism in Western literary history, the Poetics has informed serious thinking about drama ever since. Malcolm Heath's lucid translation makes the Poetics fully accessible to the modern reader. It is accompanied by an extended introduction, which discusses the key concepts in detail and includes suggestions for further reading. Now, I think some things that we need to consider is, particularly related to literary theory, criticism, are some of the overlapping concepts related to etymology. There's etymology, there is prose, there's grammar, right? And then also just concepts of translation. So if we consider, Aristotle, for all intents and purposes, wasn't writing in English, right? So even this concepts of understanding the underlying Greek and or Latin, right, that was used as part of the original interpretation of concepts of, what does it mean when we consider, what we're communicating with literary theory. It becomes really important to understand the contextualization of, that content and what culture and what society was looking at the time, and why, for all intents and purposes, the ability to write and communicate were sources of power. Right, being able to write something down was, for all intents and purposes, being able to communicate sources of truth, because traditionally the average layman, the average person, wasn't able to, based off society at the time, didn't have really the flexibility, the freedom, or the bandwidth to write and to communicate. Most people were working with their hands at the time. So, laying that sort of foundation, I think helps us to contextualize this particular book. Now, learning a little bit more about Aristotle, and then, the sort of secondary author of this book, which is the translator, Malcolm Heath, is really important for us to understand. So in the beginning, here, this sort of first intro writes: Aristotle was born in Stagaria in the dominion of the kings of Macedonia in 384 BC. For 20 years, he studied at Athens in the Academy of Plato, on whose death in 347 he left, and sometime later became tutor of the young Alexander the Great. When Alexander succeeded to the throne of Macedonia in 336, Aristotle returned to Athens and established his school and research institute, the Lyceum, to which his great erudition attracted a large number of scholars. After Alexander's death in 323, anti-Macedonian feeling drove Aristotle out of Athens, and he fled to Chalix in Euboea, where he died in 322. His writings, which were of extraordinary range, profoundly affected the whole course of ancient and medieval philosophy, and they are still eagerly studied and debated by philosophers today. Very many of them have survived, and among the most famous are the Ethics and the Politics, both of which are published in Penguin Classics together with the Athenian Constitution, De Anima, The Art of Rhetoric, Poetics, and the Metaphysics. Malcolm Heath was born in London in 1957 and was educated in Harrow and at Oxford University. He was a lecturer in Greek for a year at the University of St. Andrews and then at the University of Leeds. Since 2000, he has been professor of Greek language and literature at the University of Leeds. Apart from numerous articles, he has also published The Poetics of Greek Tragedy in 1987, Political Comedy in Aristophanes in 1897, Unity in Greek Poetics in 1989, and Hermogeneous in Issues, Strategies of Argument and Later Greek Rhetoric in 1995. So, diving into the table of contents, this book is broken down into, it looks like about 18 sections. There is an introduction, which, as I'm sort of perusing the book, takes up about the first, conservatively, like the first 40% almost. So sources telling me that we probably need to read from the introduction a little bit, and I think some of that then just sort of comes in the form of the level of difficulty of the content of this book, right? So something that we want to remember, again, if we're then mindful of the limiting nature of translation, right? If Aristotle, wrote this book in ancient Latin, so much of our understanding of reading this version of the book comes in the form of the contextualization of Malcolm Heath's translation, right? And so my assumption is that he recognizes that, a lot of our understanding is coming through the lens of how he understands what Aristotle is trying to say, and how also that is then compounded by some of the research that he has done. And so, again, my heart is telling me, and then also, if I'm being perfectly honest with you, I'm seeing I bought this book secondhand. There's lots of redlining in here, right? And so, I think, that's sort of communicating the importance of understanding how he has contextualized this content and calling certain things out, so that then provides us a frame of reference, right, to understand how maybe we should feel, or how we could feel, or maybe even how we would feel, right, if we were maybe understanding and translating the Latin from our own perspective, right? And so some of that, my challenge to you, the reader, is, maybe read this version of the book, maybe read a different translation of the book, maybe identify the pure Latin version of the book, pull out a Latin dictionary, and see if you could do it on your own, right? To then provide you this opportunity to decode the code of the ancient Latin based off of its pure power, the potency of the original intention, the original translation, and how that sort of influences your own level of consciousness, right? But that being said, going back to the introduction of the book, it then is, it goes back to then the original table of contents of the Poetics, right? Where Aristotle wrote Section 1, Human Culture, Poetry, and the Poetics. Section 2, Imitation. Section 3, Aristotle's History of Poetry. Section 4, The Analysis of Tragedy. Section 5, Plot, or the Basics. Section 6, Reversal and Recognition. Section 7, The Best Kinds of Tragic Plot. Section 8, The Pleasures of Tragedy. Section 9, The Other Parts of Tragedy. Section 10, Tragedy and the Miscellaneous Aspects. Section 11, The Epic. Section 12, Comedy. Section 13, Further Reading. Section 14, Reference Conventions. And then from there, we receive notes to the introduction, the synopsis of the Poetics. We move directly into the Poetics, and then he closes the book with notes to the translation. Human culture, poetry, and the Poetics. All human beings by nature desire knowledge. This, the opening sentence of the Metaphysics, states a fundamental premise of Aristotle's understanding of what it is to be human. He points out as evidence for his claim the pleasure we take in looking at things and assimilating information through our senses. Sensation is, of course, shared with many other animals, and the accretion of sensation through memory into experience is shared with some. But humans are unique in their capacity to derive universal judgments from their experience. Animals act by instinct or acquired habit, but humans are capable of acting from understanding. They know, as a dog might know, that this is a thing to do in certain situation, but that they may also understand, as a dog cannot, why it is the thing to do. I don't know if I agree with that, but I understand where he's going. This is what Aristotle calls in the Greek tikeni, and you guys are going to have to just give me so much grace here, right? Because I do not speak Latin. But the word is conventionally translated as craft, skill, or art. But Aristotle defines tikeni, or techni, that root word as in technique, oh my goodness, as a productive capacity informed by an understanding of its intrinsic rationale. For Aristotle, the evolution of human culture is in large part the evolution of technique. The first arts which human beings developed were those concerned with producing the necessities of their existence. Then came recreational arts, those which, while not necessary, enhance the quality of human life. In due course, activities arose which simply satisfied the desire to know. Aristotle's example is mathematics. Ultimately, philosophy emerged. Philosophy is rooted in the basic human instinct to seek knowledge. The word puzzles us and arouses our sense of wonder, and so prompts us to look for explanations. Philosophy is therefore the sophisticated descendant of primitive myth-making responses to an astonishing world. And, just taking a pause here, I love just this concept of, or I like thinking through, the Neanderthal or ancient man, and just this process of wanting to understand things. Yo, it's fire, you know what I'm saying? And fire is hot. And I know if I cook a steak on a fire, maybe it's gonna taste more, right? But how do I do that over and over again? For example, right? Just that process of, translating information or sharing information from person to person based off of, what is perhaps the most powerful word in the English language, for example, which is I. What it is that I see, which goes back to, an acronym that I use all the time, providing the dichotomy of I versus you. Well, who are you, right? And my acronym for you is YOU, your own understanding. And that dichotomy of you versus me, or I versus you, then helps to contextualize shared understanding based off of my ability to relate to you, based off of my ability to trust that you are truthful in your ability to communicate what it is that you see, what it is that you hear, what it is that you touch, and our ability to share and exchange information, right, as an opportunity to develop community with one another. And I think to this point, what he is communicating, based off of this very raw introduction, right, comes in the form of shared philosophies, right? And how can we share an experience based off of our understanding of what we can see together? And my brain is going lots of different ways right now, particularly as it relates to concepts of sense making, right? Whereas, lots of cultures, lots of world cultures have leveraged cultural storytelling techniques in order to make sense of their physical environment. Now, I'm not negating Aristotle's contribution to concepts of sense making. However, I am particularly mindful of how the cultures that then preceded Aristotle referred back to his ultimately what is a storytelling technique, right? Directly related to concepts of philosophy, morality, law, and arts and culture, right? Because that then directly bleeds into poetry, which is a concept that we're going to read a little bit more about. But let's dive back into the introduction, where he states Aristotle's sketch of human culture is relevant in a number of ways to the Poetics. Human beings produce, among other things, poems, and the productions of poems, too, can be a technique. It is an activity with its own intrinsic rationale, and it can be rendered intelligible. This does not mean that poets themselves necessarily understand what they are doing. In the Poetics, Aristotle does not treat it as a matter of any consequence whether a given poet has a reflective understanding of his craft, which communicates, right? And again, I'm going a little bit off topic here, that, the best speakers, the best translators of information don't necessarily know why they're good at what it is that they do. But the best in any given culture, they have this ability to capture the human imagination, right? They have the ability to get to the heart of a matter, get to the heart of the story based off of concepts related to tonality, to inflection, to the personification of the body, for example, right? So he writes, in chapter 8, he leaves open the question of whether Homer's grasp of correct plot structure was due to technique or to instinct. In chapter 14, he suggests that early dramatists discovered the best stories to use in tragedy by chance rather than by technique. Trial and error established a repertoire of first-rate tragic stories, but the dramatists, would not have been able to explain why those stories were best, as Aristotle thinks he can. He thinks he can, right? In his discussion of technique at the beginning of the Metaphysics, Aristotle notes that unreflective experience may produce the same result as technique. In general, the ability to do something well does not depend on understanding, nor does understanding necessarily imply an ability to do it well. A joiner taught to make a piece of furniture in a particular way may do it perfectly, even if he does not understand the reasons why that it is the best way to do it. He may not even do it better than a colleague who has more understanding but less manual dexterity, which, the layers of complexity are directly related to the pre-production meeting that we had today, right? With, Charles Moore of More Concepts, right? Where, as producers, we were basically having this conversation of the art and techniques of things, right? Whereas, there is sort of that artistic flair that, can communicate expertise in a matter, or maybe there's a scientific method where you follow a formula for doing things over and over again. And my belief, the art and science of things, you can't have one without the other, right? And the stock that, maybe society or culture has placed in Aristotle comes in the form of his scientific method for storytelling and just that pure action of documenting the methodology for philosophy, for poetry, right, was an opportunity to create a dichotomy of, providing a formula for the storytellers that followed him to then be able to take it, from their own perspective. Whereas in my opinion, those pure artists that just do it from the heart of the matter, they get equal weight into that ability. Let us discuss the art of poetry in general and its species, the effect which each species of poetry has, and the correct way to construct plots of the composition, if the composition is to be of high quality, as well as the number and nature of its component parts, and any other questions that arise within the same field of inquiry. We should begin, as is natural, by taking first principles first. Poetry as a species of imitation. Epic poetry and the composition of tragedy, as well as comedy and the arts of dithyrambic poetry, and for the most part of music, for pipe or lyre, are all taken together imitations. They can be imitated from each other in three respects: in respect of their different media of imitation, or different objects, or different mode, i.e. different manner. Medium. Some people use the medium of color and shape to produce imitations of various objects by making visual images, some through art, some through practice. Others do this by means of the voice. Similarly, in the case of the arts I have mentioned, in all of them, the medium of imitation is rhythm, language, and melody, but these may be employed either separately or in combination. For example, music for pipe or lyre and any other arts which have similar effect, e.g. music for panpipes, uses melody and rhythm only, while dance uses rhythm by itself and without melody, since dancers too imitate character, emotion, and action by means of rhythm expressed in movement. The art which uses language unaccompanied, either in prose or in verse, either combining verse forms with each other or using a single kind of verse, remains without a name to the present day. We have no general term referring to the memes of Sophron and Zerankis in Socratic dialogues, nor to any imitation that one might produce using iambic trimeters, elegiac couplets, or any other such verse form. Admittedly, people attach quote-unquote poetry to the name of the verse form and thus refer to the elegiac poets and hexameter poets. Woof! They do not call people poets because they produce imitations, but indiscriminately on the basis of their verse or their use of verse. In fact, even if someone publishes a medical or scientific text in verse, people are in the habit of applying the same term. But Homer and Empedocles have nothing in common except the form of verse they use, so it would have to be fair to call the former a poet, but the latter a natural scientist rather than a poet. And I'll pause here, this is complex stuff, but in my opinion, going back to the art and science of things, if we even take that block of text that we read, you can break that down into the science of things, right? We can talk about the number of words that we read in that block of text. We can literally count down the number of syllables that we read. We could break it down into the number of words that we read, the number of letters that were a part of each word, right? But does that contextualize the summary of what we read, that science? Because then we could break it down into the art form, right? What words were more scientific words versus what words were more poetic words? How did those words make us feel? What colors did we see in our brain, or did the colors make us feel, for example? Going back to the art and science of things, right? Super important concepts that we need to be able to contextualize. All right, so, my recommendation is that we, again, just through this lens of Tsundoku and tea, let's maybe get through one more section. If I'm being perfectly honest with you, as a writer, this feels more like a study guide, and I'm not really sure that this needs to be read in one full sweep. I think that, through this lens of allowing this book to be a book that allows us to deconstruct other pieces of media that we can consume, right, through this lens of the history of storytelling, it becomes an opportunity for us to learn how to be more objective, right? Particularly through, literary concepts of, the object and the subject. And that even goes back, in my opinion, to concepts of quality, right? Where in my opinion, good is good and bad is bad. Some of us waste time, in my opinion, consuming content that is not functionally good, right? And we're sort of allowing junk food to enter our system or enter our brains, right? Versus if we can, sort of or learn to appreciate concepts of storytelling through this lens of both the art and science, that maybe allows us to develop a flavor, a taste of high quality media and content, and be able to see the people that are competing for our stream resources, right? And we could use that in lots of different ways, concepts of the streaming content that you're watching on Netflix, but then also, I use this acronym of, protect your stream, your space, your time, your relationships, your energy, your attention, and your money, right? And if you're mindful of these concepts of what you're allowing to stream within you, in my opinion, some of that then comes in the form of, you don't need to be eating junk food all day. Maybe this is an opportunity for you to create on your own, right? And tell the stories that you think are worth telling. But through that lens, right, through this lens of objectivity and subjectivity, we're going to read through The Object, where he writes, those who imitate agents and those who must be either admirable or inferior. Character almost always corresponds to just those two categories, since everyone is differentiated in character by defect or excellence. Alternatively, they must be better people than we are, or worse, or of the same sort. Compare painters. Polygnotus portrayed better people, Pauson, worse people, Dionysus, people similar to us. So it is clear that each of the kinds of imitation mentioned above will exhibit these differences and will be distinguished by the imitation of distinct objects in this way. These dissimilarities, are possible in dance and in music for pipe or lyre, and are also in connection with language and unaccompanied verse. For example, Homer imitates better people, Cleophon, people similar to us, and Hegemon of Thasus, who invented parodies, or Nicocaris, the author of the Diliad, worse people. Similarly, in connection with dithyrambs and gnomes, one can imitate as Timotheus and Philoxenus did the Cyclops. The very same difference distinguishes tragedy and comedy from each other. The latter aims to imitate people worse than our contemporaries, the former better. Which, mindful, and again, you guys are just gonna have to like bear with me. This fan is hot in here, and I'm also working. I'm under the hot the hot stove, dealing with all these like ancient Greek names. But broadly, what he's communicating is that when we're thinking through objects and imitating concepts of storytelling related to the subject of the matter, right? Each sort of author or storyteller is going to have sort of their own kind of flair, right? And so some of that subjectivity as the audience is like being able to understand what our tastes are, right? Who we like listening to, and understanding why we like listening to them based off of their ability to imitate life, right? And that's all art is. Art imitates life, or vice versa, which is, sort of a fascinating concept to consider. All right, y'all. These Greek names or these Latin names are kicking your boy's butt. So I think we're getting ready to wrap up today's episode of Tsundoku and Tea. Mindful of just broad lessons of storytelling and the power that history has in terms of compelling our levels of consciousness, right? And if you walk away with anything today, it's my broad hope that you begin to understand how the ancient Greeks and, even, some of the Romans of previous ages, concepts of, their methodology for storytelling, for philosophy, broad concepts of, quality, poetry, and, for all intents and purposes, ethics, have had an opportunity to influence your own level of consciousness based off of the translation, based off of the codification, the ancient codes, right, that are then indicative of modern levels of consciousness, which, again, if we're then mindful of concepts of Tsundoku and tea, it really boils down to taking time to consider, right, how that information has the ability to impact you, and it behooves you, for all intents and purposes, to make some choices, to make some decisions on how you're going to allow someone else's information to ultimately impact you. So on that note, I appreciate you being here with me today. I look forward to considering and researching what we're going to read next. And cheers to you. Catch you on the flip side.